This week on Three Questions with Corey Kareem.
But I think Michael Todd said it. He said the best version of you is the disciplined you. You the reason.
Ooh, say that one more time. We gotta pull that back.
Yeah, Michael Todd said, Pastor Todd said the best version of you is the disciplined you, and it's the version of you that has boundaries.
Clockwise, 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 clockwise. Never turn back. Only go clockwise. Never go back.
Now, before we get started with this beautiful conversation, please help a brother out and click on that follow button on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Enjoy the conversation. Welcome back, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Three Questions with Corey Kareem, the podcast where we sit down with some amazing people who are doing some amazing things. And that's right, you guessed it. We have some 3 questions, sometimes 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I know. I read the comments. But rather than just talk about my guests, their wins or their successes, we tend to start the conversation around their failures, more specifically, the lessons that they learn from those individual experiences. So, with that being said, my guest today is a man of many titles and inspiring stories. His moniker is AP, which stands for Accountability Partner. I love that. One of my favorite words in the English language, by the way. He's a dedicated U.S. service member, a passionate lobbyist, a skilled public affairs professional, a former elected official, and most importantly, a man of faith. Can I get an amen? With that being said, my guest today has been on an incredible journey of highs and challenging lows. Throughout his childhood and early adulthood, he battled obesity, struggled with failed attempts at weight loss, and silently fought against bouts of depression and even contemplating suicide. However, in August of 2023, everything changed for him during a pivotal moment in his dorm room in Little Rock, Arkansas. In that transformative moment, he looked himself in the mirror and made a decision that would alter the course of his life. So get ready to be inspired, motivated, and moved by none other than Juan Blocker, aka AP. Welcome to the podcast, brother.
Hey, bro, thank you for having me, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. And hello to all of your audience, your viewers.
Thank you, man, Juan. So let me give a backstory to all my listeners, to my audience. I met this brother here in the lobby, in the hallways at the podcast summit in Atlanta that happened early July. I think it was July 4th, might have been Independence Day, 2024. And I heard a bit of his story. It was kind of eavesdropping. He was talking to somebody else, and I was like, man, I gotta get to know this brother. He was just dropping little bits and pieces of his story, and I was like, they need to hear this, something special. So we connected at the podcast summit, which is ran by David Shands and his entity, which is a great podcast summit, by the way. And that's where we met. Now, Juan, I know I gave you a pretty decent intro, but is there anything else that you'd like to add to what I shared about your background and about who you are and what you're doing, what you're about?
No, I mean, I think you did a great job with the introduction, and I mean, the only thing that I would add is that my story isn't mine, and I realized that over the course of this 11 months, the story, right, the path that we find ourselves on, and the storms that we go through, oftentimes we believe that those storms are only for us, but in all actuality, God sometimes has us go through these storms so that we can share those stories and storms to let somebody else know that they too can make it through.
Ooh, man, he's been listening to my podcast, y'all, because you know what's interesting about what you just said there, Juan. At the end of every episode, I always end with, sometimes you don't need to learn or see or hear anything new. You just need to hear or see that somebody else went through it too.
Yeah,
Right?
that's good.
So, man, you hit it right on the nail there. So with that being said, Juan, let's jump right into this. With my podcast, I like to kind of get to the meat and potatoes, as they like to say. So I'd like to know what has been either one of your biggest failures, setbacks to date, or one of your most memorable failures or setbacks to date. What happened? How did you get through it? And most importantly, what did you learn from it?
Yeah. No, this is good. I think just off the top, I spent so much of my early childhood, or I would say like high school years, up until early adulthood into my professional career, uh, putting special emphasis and tying my identity, behind my titles.
Mm,
And just to put things into perspective for you, I went to public schools in Prince George's County, Maryland. And in the state of Maryland, they have a student that gets elected to serve on the local board of education. And so after, two failed attempts, I was eventually elected by the entire student body. And at the time, I represented 130,000 school students and served on the school board and got to make decisions with, adults on the board about the entire school system. And, I was very controversial at times because I got to see a behind the scenes look of how politics really works behind the scenes when it comes to, you know, the one of the most local ways of government, which is a board of education.
mhm,
And, I'll be honest with you, I was overlooked oftentimes. I had always wanted to fit in, and I didn't. Tried to pan sag, and I was a rapper. At one point, they called me K9, and I really had no sense of direction. I just wanted to be accepted.
mhm,
And, for a while, I wasn't until I had this title of school board member. And so, along the journey, I had my own office. I would wear full pledged suits to school, and that created an issue, as you can imagine. And I was walking around with a MacBook and an iPhone, and literally had the CEO of the entire school system on speed dial. Um, and so I share that to say that, you know, I had tied my identity to that title because I was accepted. Like, people will call on me, can you speak at this event? Can you help us with this issue? And it empowered me. And then it led me to be on all these different local news channels. And so I said, not knowing it at the time, but I was accepted, right?
mhm.
And, when I went to college, I was asked by a few of my colleagues at the time to actually run for the full time seat. And so, here I was in college, didn't have a lot of money, freshman at Bowie State University. And at the age of 20, I had put my name on a ballot to run for an actual elected office, which is the school board. And so I didn't have a car at the time. I didn't have all these resources, but I was going after a dream because I wanted to make a difference. But again, I didn't realize that I had tied my entire identity behind it. And so after ultimately losing that election, I felt like my entire world shattered because Juan Blocker was Juan Blocker, the school board member. And it took me up until, losing this weight to realize that those titles didn't really matter. And, we have so many folks that if they're not careful, they tie their identity and not necessarily their purpose with their title. And then when that title's gone, because titles are often short lived, if you're not careful, you don't know who you are after that. And I didn't know who
Mm.
I was.
Wow. So many things come to mind. And one of the things that come to mind for me, Juwan, is when I hear your story, and thank you for sharing that, is I think about athletes, professional
Mm,
athletes who, if they're privileged enough, they're talented enough to make the NBA, NFL, MLB, what have you,
yeah,
they probably were stars when they were in grade school, junior high school, college, what have you. So
yeah,
they've been the guy, the number one guy, maybe number two, possibly number three guy on their team their whole entire life, essentially.
hmm,
Right. So they're used to being a star player. They get to the league, they have various levels of success, and then they get out of the league. And I find like a majority of them are like, now what?
yeah,
Now what do I do? My whole life, my identity was tied to this one sport,
Yeah.
And now I'm no longer great or efficient or effective at that sport. Now what I do, and you hear the stats like 80% of athletes go broke within a certain amount of time frame, so on and so forth. They spin out, and so I think about being, tied to a particular identity. So I want to ask, like, how did you rectify that? How did you come to terms and say, no, this is who I really am? Like, what were your steps that you took to find yourself, so to speak?
Yeah. I mean, it took a while, but I really had to pray to God.
Mm-hmm.
And, like my relationship at the time, it wasn't the best with God. So growing up, you know, my grandparents, Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
uh, step parent was Pentecostal. So my mom was not, so I sort of had to figure things out. But every time I would leave church, no matter which denomination it was, I just felt like a weight had been lifted off of my shoulders. And
Mm.
so, but I'll be honest with you, it wasn't until, so, okay, just to speed things up for you. After losing, I went back to Bowie State University to finish out my degree. And then at that time, I decided that I was going to be in the military to prove a point. So I ended up, going to all these different recruiters and then landed on being in the Army National Guard. But it wasn't until I was working for my then boss, Comptroller Peter Francho, that I realized that I needed to really lock in with God, right? So he ran for governor this last election cycle, and he had lost to now Maryland Governor Wes Moore, who was the first African American governor in the entire country and in the state of Maryland. And I was getting ready to be out of a job. For those of your viewers that don't know how this works, when you are specifically in the profession of politics and you're politically appointed, you literally only have the time that that person is in office, to basically work there. And then when it comes time for that person to change office, or let's say they lose an election, you have to figure out how to make a deal and connections to stay in that new administration, or you have to find something else to do. And so, in between times, I was freaking out because I didn't know how I was going to pay my mortgage. I have kids and like a mortgage, and I was freaking out. And so I was doing DoorDash and working at Buffalo Wild Wings and still showing up for military drill. And I got to a point where I was so stressed out that I didn't know where I was going to go, that I had landed on wanting to be a cop. And I had always
Hmm.
had aspirations of being a cop, but I didn't feel deep down inside that that's where God wanted me to go. But I know you've probably been in a situation, or some of your viewers, where it's kind of like you're like, all right, I need stability for my family. I might this profession is probably not like my top one, but
Mm-hmm.
it's something that's going to pay the bills. And so, like,
Yep.
I was literally in the process of getting ready to be a police officer, but like I had so much difficulty even going through that process, because internally I'm like, come on, God, like you've put me on these different stages. You had me working in these offices, and people see the impact that I'm making. So why do I feel like I have to settle? No offense to my law enforcement folks that do law enforcement as a passion, but why am I having to do this? And like, I literally had to talk to God, because I was applying for jobs, applying for jobs, applying for jobs. I would make it to the finals for all of this stuff, or people would ask me for my ideas during the interview process, but then they would say, unfortunately, we're going with somebody else. And so
Mm.
nobody could help me at that point except for God. And I was praying. My wife would tell you, like, we were trying to figure things out because I did not know what we were going to do. But how is it that I'm right? I have an office and I have a name and an identity, and I'm hobnogging with these politicians. But then, in the evenings, I'm, busting dishes or swinging wings at like Buffalo Wild Wings, trying to save money to the side just in case I wasn't going to find a job. And so I had to go to God. I did, and I realized that at that point, my title didn't matter. It really didn't.
Man, such intricate insights there. I think one of the things that resonated for me, you said you had kind of posed the question. He's like, I don't know if many of your viewers or listeners can relate to like taking that second or third job that's not really kind of what they were brought up to do or went to school for, or what they were called to do. I could relate to that a lot. I had a lot of side hustle jobs, on my way, and to be very transparent with you, Juan, I'm what you would call a late bloomer, right? Now,
Mm,
let me give you some context. You know, I was a type of kid. Let's talk early adulthood. Let's talk late teens, so like 18, 19, early 20s. I did all the right steps. Went to college, no criminal record, none of
yeah,
that statistical stuff that a lot of men in our community
yeah,
happen to fall victim to, so to speak. Right?
yeah.
Graduate from college, 3.2, 3.5 GPA, intern at some of the best companies in the world. Get
Wow.
Apple's my first gig out of college, and then I get a job on Wall Street, 25. So I'm kind of like ahead of the trend. Then I had a situation that took me back. And next thing you know, I'm on my mom's couch in a basement apartment, you know,
Wow.
being like, WTF? Like, what did I do? And I was literally asking God, like, why me? I did all the things, the right things, right? And so I ended up in this season in my life, and I say season because it was more than a few years, where
Yeah.
it's like odd jobs. I worked at a call center. You talking about Buffalo Wild Wings. I was probably one of the first Uber Eats drivers when Uber started venturing out into
Wow.
that. So I did that for a couple of years to help pay down my student loans, right? For some extra cash. And I did that for about 2 years. So for 2 years, I had no weekends. And I say all that to say I'm 39 now. I'm about to turn 40 this year. God bless.
Yeah.
And I really didn't start having true success until I was in my mid 30s, while a lot of my friends started to experience success a little bit earlier than I did.
Yeah.
And so I could totally relate to the whole odd jobs and why am I having to do this if I've done all these other things, man. So, and that's part of the reason actually I started this podcast, Juwan, because for much of my life, I felt like a failure. I felt like I was behind. I was like, God, I did all this stuff. Like, what? Like, why am I even here? And there was even one point too where with social media, I couldn't even look at other people's feeds. It
Yeah.
would bother me if I saw their success. That's where I was in that life. So when you said that, that really resonated with me.
But the interesting thing about that though, right?
Mm.
And what I'm learning, and you don't look your age first and foremost.
Thank
I
you,
mean,
sir.
I'm 26, and sometimes God reroutes us. So
Mm.
I think you know we have a vision, right? Like oftentimes we have a vision in our head with what we're going to do, and then we check off what society says are these boxes, and then it seems like, all right, we're going in the right direction, and then something like your situation of mine, it reroutes us. And at least in my situation, I felt like this was rerouting me to a higher calling for where God wanted me to ultimately be. But
Mm.
sometimes it just takes some of that rerouting, and him not I'm not going to say humbling, but him reminding us that he's still in control. And even during those dark times, those tough seasons, that we have to lean on him and his understanding and not ours, so that we know that he exists, right? And so then
Mm.
what he's able to do is he's able to take the glory for what he did, so that when we're having conversations like this on your amazing podcast, your audience can say, hey, look, without a doubt, man, God has really blessed him, and God was in this every step of the way.
Yeah, 1000%. And to look back at it now, I always usually ask this question
Mm-hmm.
to my guests when they share their stories. It's like, if you could go back in time, would you change that situation that was a rough experience, a tough time for you? Would you change it? And 9 times out of 10, people will say no, because
Yeah,
that experience taught them so much. They grew so much. And if it wasn't for that experience, they might not be where they are right
yeah,
now.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I can
yeah,
definitely relate to that, man. So let's talk obesity. I really want to touch on that. I know I brought it up a bit in your bio. So
yeah,
throughout your childhood and early adulthood, you were diagnosed with obesity and struggled to lose weight several times. With that in mind, can you walk us through the moment when you said, you know what, that's it, and decided to make a change in your health and wellness journey while in your dorm room in Little Rock,
Yeah.
Arkansas?
Yeah. Look, I was always the heavy or the fat one in my family, and always the person that they call moly 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 because I have a birthmark right here on the side of my face,
Mm-hmm.
and always had like man boobs. And it just seemed like my siblings, my cousins, like they seemed to always have like faster metabolisms. And so for a long period of time, it really bothered me. And in order to try to prove a point to everybody, like I could be tough, right? Or like I could get this girl that I like, you know, I got to a point where, it really led me to want to do the military because I, at the time, was so insecure that I wanted my body to look like theirs or even better. And
Mm.
so, leading up to Arkansas, like I was in the Maryland Army National Guard, now I'm in the DC National Guard, but I kept failing PT tests. And, I was on COVID-19 orders at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to really eat and I didn't know about meal prep. So I would always go to McDonald's. And so that, as you can imagine, testing people for COVID all day while my wife is pregnant and then only being able to have like 30 minutes to eat, the quickest thing and the cheapest thing for me was to go to McDonald's. And so, as you can imagine, after a while, I started putting on even more weight. And then I got in the military, they do height and weight and then they do a PT test. And if you get flagged, it stops you from being able to use your like military benefits to go to college, like tuition or like getting promoted. And so for a while, I didn't pass PT test, and I got tired of like being taped and being fat and having boobs. And so I got sent over to Arkansas to relearn my MOS, which is my military job. And I looked in the mirror and I was late for my kids and family, and I was in my own dorm room, so I basically had no choice but to face myself. So I went to class, then you come back and you got a bunch of hours of free time. And so like I took my shirt off, I had really big breasts, and I had no choice but to face it. And so I literally texted my wife one night and I was like, babe, I'm getting tired of being fat and unhealthy, and I got to change. And I had tried to do it in the past, but I didn't really have the skill set to be able to do it or the know-how. And so, like, my wife supports me without a doubt, but it was kind of one of them things like, oh, okay, like, okay, that sounds good, but like it had
Mm.
those things where it's like, all right, you got to believe it to see it. And I was working out in Arkansas trying to get healthier foods that I thought was healthier, and literally from August of last year up until this point, I have lost over 40 pounds, and that's simply from trial and error of eating right, going to the gym, and then I even got to the point in which I was getting paid to train somebody how to lose weight. And, that ultimately led me to being at the podcast summit. So, I lie to you not, I was upstairs. We were getting my kids dressed for school, for daycare. And like this local Fox 5 news reporter, she was doing a segment on entrepreneurship. And she was like, if you need help trying to expand your brand, at that time I had already like started doing videos about like my journey. And I was like, man, I would really like to push out my reach. And so I had the crazy idea of emailing her saying who I was, showing her my before and after photo, and trying to get on Fox 5 to talk about my fitness journey. And
Mm.
so my wife was like, come on, Jawan, like we gotta get the kids together. I said, babe, give me a second. I'm emailing Fox 5. She thought I was crazy. I lie
Mhm.
to you not. Um, Sent the email in, had a few grammar mistakes, by the way, but I sent the email in. And then the day after, I was listening to I Trust in God. And like I had my head on the steering wheel, and I said, God, I said, I don't know what you're doing with my testimony and my journey, but I know that I'm a speaker and that's what you called me to do. And so I said, if this is meant to be, the door will open itself. I didn't hear back. About 2 days later, my wife runs into the room early in the morning. She said, your godmother's on the phone. She said, babe, you're on Fox 5. And
What?
like, bro, it was so insane because I felt like the prayer was answered. But check this out. The Fox the Makia Turner is her name. The reporter had an inbox full of different people trying to pitch their ideas, and most of these folks were already established, seasoned professionals. And so I can't think of the gentleman's last name, but his name is Andrew, and he was responsible for putting together the lights and everything for David Shantz's podcast summit, and he was the person taking questions and giving advice. And so they waited and then did my before and after pic, explained what I wanted to do, and I said I wanted to do a podcast about health and fitness. And he says, "Oh, this is dope. My client David Shantz has a podcast summit in Atlanta. We would love to talk to him and give him a free ticket to go to the podcast summit." And so that's how I ended up being at the podcast summit. I had to pay to get there, but they gave me 2 complimentary tickets to be in that room.
Wow.
It was insane.
Wow. That is an amazing story, man. And so for the folks out there that are in a similar situation with their weight loss journey, if you were to give any kind of, personal hacks that you use, whether from a habitual standpoint, dietary, like what are some kind of hacks, tricks, whatever you want to call them, that you would recommend to that person right now that's struggling with that weight loss?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First and foremost, it's okay, weigh yourself the first time, but stay off of the scale for at least the first 2 or 3 months. Because what happen is you'll notice that you'll go to the gym, and let's say that you put in all the work, but like you'll take your shirt off, you look in the mirror, and you get on the scale, and you're going to be discouraged because you're not going to see any changes, and it'll take a couple of weeks rather for you to start noticing small subtle changes. But then it's like you'll be like, hey, I feel like I'm changing, or my pants are getting smaller, or I feel like my waist is starting to get smaller, but the scale doesn't change. Your scale is encompassing everything. It's not, it's your fat, it's the water, the whole nine. So stay off of the scale. The second thing is stop comparing where you are with somebody else, because you see somebody that has 6-pack abs, bodybuilder, whatever the case might be. But keep in mind, don't be naive, don't be deceived. It takes years to get some of the bodies that you want. And then in some cases, I'm not knocking anybody at all, but you don't know what type of enhancements that person is taking, but you're sitting there comparing yourself to that person.
Facts.
Then the other piece I would say is, like I said, track your your results, but then also look at what you're eating. Nutrition is the most important thing, and you want to make sure that your diet is sustainable. I can sit here and give you an 8-week plan that I have you look shredded, but you literally have to go point by point in order to do that. And I bet money today that if I gave you that plan, you probably wouldn't stick with it, because you're going to be miserable, because the foods and things that you're going to eat are not things that are sustainable. Some of these bodybuilders, all these folks that are competing, it's a sport. So they're used to eating a certain way for a certain amount of time to get desired results. If you want this to be, sustainable in a lifestyle, then you have to be able to incorporate fun foods and healthier foods so that, you can sustain this for a lifetime. Look at some of these bodybuilders. A lot of them, if you look at them later on in life, I love Ronnie Coleman, the Deaf, and Arnold, and all these other big leads in the game. But if you look at how they look back then and how they look now, they're sort of banged up because they were doing it for sport. You're doing it for life. I'm trying to reach out to people that are trying to get off that are trying to get off of medicines, right? That have hypertension, that have problems, health conditions that could be prevented if they do a little bit more exercising. And I've had family. My grandfather had prostate cancer last year. My mother-in-law had breast cancer. Like, my wife has hypertension and all of these other medical conditions. And so I don't compare my results with anybody else, because I'm doing it for a different reason. And I'm sorry I'm going on the rant, but I'll stop here.
Good.
But those are some of the things that I would recommend. But if I had to say the most important thing, the overarching thing, you need to figure out why you want to do this. Your reason needs to be deeply rooted in something, in my opinion, outside of looking good. Because I can tell you that the Fox 5 thing, right? Being interviewed, the people reaching out to me for podcasts, or even giving me compliments. That is far and few in between. I'm doing this because what I've realized, and my reasons have changed over the last month, but what I've realized is that I had to lose over 40 pounds of physical weight so that I could lose that mental weight that was prolonging me from being able to answer God's calling aka his purpose for my life. And I can't be out here and calling myself somebody's accountability partner if I'm only focused on the physical. When I was in Arkansas, when I was going to the gym to bury insecurities at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning in 30 and 40-degree weather, I realized that I had to look myself in the mirror, break myself down, make sure that I incorporate God and figure out why else I'm doing it. And I almost took my life because I didn't understand my purpose. And I didn't understand it because I had so much mental fog. But now my purpose is a lot more clear than what it was now, which is why I'm starting to experience some of the overflow and why I'm able to chop it up and have this conversation with you today. And that's
Wow. Wow. You know what? You hit on so many points there, and thank you for sharing that. And, especially the point about how you can't just do it for the physical kind of rewards, right?
yeah,
Which is motivating and inspiring. We're not going to downplay that. But you also made to the point that, losing the 40 pounds of physical weight allowed you to drop let's say the 40 pounds of mental weight that was kind of holding you back. And it just reminded me of a conversation that I had with one of my good friends out here who owns a private gym in Toronto. Shouts out to Nswani. Um, we talk about how physical fitness is related to mental health.
yeah,
They're intertwined with each other. I know we like to separate them because they are two different things, but they're interconnected.
yeah,
And you talked about, the most important thing. You said the overarching thing when it comes to your weight loss journey is being grounded in your why. And I think for me,
yeah.
one thing that's helped me to stay consistent within the gym, although I may ebb and flow on the waistline a little bit, is
You
um
good, bro?
is when I go to the gym, it's a great stress reliever for me. Any type of tension, negative energy, whatever, that is one of my ways I release all of that, and the feeling I get. They talk about those endorphins that are released after you work out or after you go for a run. That is the
Yeah,
reason why I go there, because when you feel good, then you do good, right? And so for me, yeah, I like to have, like, a nice looking body, but the
yeah,
release of the tension, the negative energy, and the stress is the
yeah, yeah,
number one reason I continue to go to the gym.
yeah.
Amazing. One other thing, since we're on this health topic right here, what are your thoughts on Ozempic, real quick?
I think all I'm going to say is this, because my mom she thinks she needs this surgery. Unless you have been medically diagnosed and you need to go through like a gastro bypass or something like that, in my opinion, I think that people need to stop looking for an easy way out and simply focus on their nutrition and strength training 3 times out of the week and at least 30 minutes of cardio. And I think you'll be fine. Because again, I think drugs like Ozempic and all this other stuff, in my opinion, I don't think it's necessary for everybody. And I don't even know if we fully understand the long-term effects of it. And
Mm.
I'm getting mixed messages about it, but if you know that you don't have any underlying medical condition where it's like you need to have weight removed for medical reasons, then you got to stop looking for an easier way out, in my opinion.
I love it. I love it. Um, so my next question for you is, how has faith in God played a role in your journey towards better health and wellness? And in what ways has it helped you to stay motivated and committed to your goals?
Yeah, yeah. God is my foundation. God is everything. My wife will tell you. So when I was hired, especially like in the political space, because I had got involved, so I've been in politics since I was like 15, 16 years old. And
Hmm.
so because I was good at working in my hometown, I noticed that a lot of my jobs, so for my professional career, I've always been thus far the youngest and in some cases the only black person in the room in my space. And
Mm.
so folks have been able to, utilize me in specific communities because of my relationships. And so at one point I was super cocky and pressed to be in people's face because I'm like, I'm the Prince George's County guy. Like you can't do when it comes to that. But again, like God played a role in humbling me because I had put my belief system to an extent and my job security behind one person getting elected, you know, so that I can continue on my job. But in a world, and I get it, like it's normal, right? Like everybody's worried about job security, especially in times of high inflation and things of that sort. But what we're not talking about is God's security. You're talking
Mm.
about job security, but what about God's security? Money comes and goes, and titles come and go. And so what I realized once I was faced with almost not having a job, I had no choice but to turn to God. And that's the role that he plays. God is my everything, and he gives me the strength and the ability to be able to do what I do. He gives me the strength and the ability to be able to work out. Like I talk about losing 40 pounds, but if God didn't wake me up each and every day and make sure that I was squared away to be able to go to the gym, none of that would be possible.
Mm.
It wouldn't. And that's why I ultimately got to the point where I realized that I want folks to be able to identify what their talent is in life so that they can, because I strongly believe that there's overflow when
Mm-hmm.
you are obedient to God's calling and then just operating in who you are, right? Like, I'll give you a quick example. I did a post on LinkedIn, and it was a before and after picture of me, and I talked about how, basically titles weren't all that significant. And I lie to you not, that post went viral and had over 242,000
Oh
impressions,
wow.
4,000 likes.
Wow.
And what I noticed as I was going through the comments, right, and looking at the different people that were viewing my profile, was that there were so many folks that had the icon open for work. And so what resonated with me about that in my head, ooh, thank you, God, was what if, oftentimes, like, it's in society nowadays, it's so easy to sign up to somebody's job, right, and put in a job application. It's harder to really sit with God and identify what his divine purpose is for your life. And so, it's easy for us to get a salary and stand in line and get the weekends off. And so what I realized was that, what if some folks, not everybody, but what if some folks are out of a job or a season is going dry right now because God is trying to get your attention and get you to tap into the natural gifts that he's given you so that
Mm.
you can reach that overflow by being obedient, and just on every platform that he gives you, acknowledge him as being the one that did it.
Mm. Mm.
Like that. So that's the mind space that I'm in. And,
Mm-hmm.
I say it all the time, and it makes so much sense as I'm talking to you. If you notice, why do we have so many entrepreneurs coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic? In my opinion, we had so many entrepreneurs because so many people were out of jobs that they had no choice but to figure out a way to be creative and tap into what God had already sold in their heart. I'm
Mm.
called to speak. I've been speaking on platforms and stages and even podcasts before I even knew podcasting was a thing, since I was like 16, 17. And I
Mm.
went back yesterday over the last week and like was telling my wife, yo, did you check this out? Look, and I started putting stuff together. It's the same thing. And so when you acknowledge God for God, and when you get to when he elevates you, it's important that you continue to shout his name and let people know what he did for you, so that other people know that he exists and that he's living in all of us. But you got to be willing to put in the work to meet him, because God is a gentleman. God is not going to sit here and force you to do anything. We have free will. But I think Michael Todd said it. He said the best version of you is the discipline you. You're the reason.
Ooh. Say that. Say that. Say that one more time. You gotta pull that back.
Yeah, Michael Todd said, Pastor Todd said, the best version of you is the disciplined you, and it's the version of you that has boundaries. I looked a complete mess mentally and physically, but what the reason why I shine the way that I do now, and I say that humbly, is because God had enough patience with me to still deal with my mess and bring me back to focus for what he wants me to do. And so now I look the way that I do and
Mm.
feel the way that I do because he's done that. That's all glory to God.
Wow. So I gotta ask you. Is having faith necessary?
Oh, absolutely.
Is
Absolutely.
it specifically?
Yeah.
Is it necessary to have a fruitful, successful, productive life on this planet?
Yeah. 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 I strongly believe with all my heart that it is, because if you were to ask me several years ago some of the stages that I've been on, like if I was solely going off of man and going off of what statistics say,
Mm-hmm.
look, I grew up in poverty. I mean, my grandparents middle class, but like I have several siblings. We were living apartment to apartment. I went to a school big on free and reduced lunch, and oftentimes I had the DoorDash to get a couple of dollars to put money in my pocket. If I would have allowed man to tell me that I wasn't going to be successful, then I wouldn't have been here today being able to speak to you. And so I think what happens, especially for your viewers that are, that follow Christ, I think what happens is that we got to remember that God has sold in you before you were born a unique purpose that only you can fulfill. But the enemy or the devil also knows what God's plan is for you. And so when you say that you're going to do something, don't think that the enemy or that evil spirit isn't trying to hold you back. And so what the enemy will do is he'll hear it, and his job is to intercept you before you get to your divine purpose, because he knows that once you get there, then it's going to do good and free other people from bondage. When I
Mm.
talk about me being suicidal, I was getting ready, I was contemplating to end my life on the very night that I was getting an award for being the youngest at the age of 17. I got a public service award, 40 under 40 award at the age of 17. What a lot of people didn't know until I shared this video a couple days ago was that that very night I was shaking hands with politicians and getting that award. I was contemplating suicide, what day I was going to do it, and I was also contemplating funeral arrangements. But
Mm.
if God didn't keep me and encourage me to still move forward through that, I would have not had 4 kids like I have. I would not have the house, and I would not be where I am today to talk to you. And so, what I'm hoping to do through sharing my testimony is to free people from mental bondage. More specifically, our young people. There
Mm.
are so many young people that have so many gifts and talents, but society each and every day, they strip us of our own identity as adults. And so you're also doing the same thing to kids that are still trying to figure out what their identities are, by telling them that if they don't wear this or that, then they're not cool or popular. Which is
Mm.
why I strongly believe that because they don't know who they are, or in some cases they don't know who God is and what He has for you later in life, you're willing, not knowing, to want to take your life. You do that, the devil wins. And there are people that are counting on you that you may not ever know. Let's not get it twisted. I call myself, I'm planting seeds. So whoever's listening to your podcast, you're planting seeds, because you're going to say something. Your testimony is going to plant seed in somebody, and it'll, even if it doesn't take root until after you're gone, that's a piece of your legacy because you freed somebody from bondage. And that's why this space for me, this podcasting space, is so unique. I'm not worried about the monetization of a podcast. At some point, I believe that that could be a byproduct of being obedient to God. But my job right now with this voice that I have is to use the podcasting space as a vehicle to speak for those that don't have a voice, or those that feel voices, or those that don't have the courage right now to speak truth to their life and to other people's lives. And that's why I appreciate you so much for giving me yet another opportunity and a platform to speak with you, to learn from you, and then also your audience. Like, I don't take that for granted at all.
Well, amen to that, and I receive all of that, brother. I appreciate that. You touched on something you just said there. You mentioned, struggling in silence with depression, despite being pretty successful at the time. And you talked about obviously contemplating suicide, right? Even while receiving an award. So, how
Yeah.
did you learn to kind of open up about your mental health struggles, and what advice do you have for others who may be facing similar challenges?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the first thing, and I know it's for some folks, it's like, it's cliche, right? Like if I say turn to God, because a lot of folks, it's so much easier to pick up the phone because you'll hear versus talking to God, because sometimes you might not necessarily hear from him immediately. But turning to God was huge. But I also want to publicly thank my wife, Shakia Blocker, who was this Shakia Campbell, because she was a girlfriend at the time. And when I tell you that she is a praying wife, like before we were even married, she prayed over my mental state, and she helped me. And she happened to have a relationship and understood the importance and power of therapy. I look down at therapy, especially as a guy. I'm like, I'm not talking to no therapist. I don't even know you, and I'm not about to be vulnerable with you, and I don't want you to judge me. But in all actuality, what I recommend, and this is after maybe like 4 or 5 years of not having a therapist, to seek therapy. And when I say seek therapy, I mean, literally going on Google. I don't know if it's psychology.com or whatever it is,
Yep.
but
That's the right one.
you can tailor your search and find somebody that works for you. And then you have to get, I know it's uncomfortable, but you have to, in my opinion, get uncomfortable with being comfortable if you need help. And sometimes it's nice to have somebody, especially a trained professional, that can put things into perspective for you, because oftentimes when you're going through things, you're in tunnel vision. So I have a therapist that's able to put things into perspective, which gives me a fresh outlook on life from like a practical sense, but then from that spiritual sense, also pouring into to God is what my recommendations are. And then of course you can use the gym as an outlet, but don't do what I did, which was follow a lot of the propaganda on TikTok about like men. You need to go to the gym and get your stress out solely there, because what you're going through, because you're just burying it. You're just burying those insecurities. And what I tell people all the time is that when I was in that moment, I told them that I was using the gym as a graveyard to bury my insecurities. That's what I was doing. So I was burying them, but I wasn't actually solving them. And so, AP is important because accountability partner is the uncut, authentic Juan Blocker, which is somebody that I couldn't be when I was Juan Blocker, solely the politician, where I had the suit on and I couldn't say certain things. And being, truly transparent with you, I am still in politics. I am a lobbyist. I am in public relations. And, I understand that even this conversation and what I'm saying and opening up about these topics, these are issues that folks are dealing with that are in my profession. But I just pray to God that at some point he lays it on their heart to be able to have the courage to share those stories and know that they're more than their titles. I've lost maybe 3 or 4 folks thus far that have been in politics to suicide. And folks were like, I didn't understand. They had this title and they seemed to be happy, but they were really miserable. And I chalk it out to an extent to being, scared to really express who they are, what they're dealing with, out of fear of losing an election or looking weak, and being judged. But my judge minds is God.
Right. And to that point you just ended with, that's why I say vulnerability is a currency. If used in a very authentic way. And there's something that you said earlier on, and I'm glad you said it. And I think this happens a lot, especially with people that grew up in the church and then are, purely faith-based. They sometimes neglect the tools that I think that God has provided for us. There's that saying that, the Lord works in mysterious ways. And I feel like all of us are tools that that God has placed around us. And I find it a little bit, I don't know if silly is the right word, but that's the word I'm just going to use right now. When, people of faith neglect that portion, the therapist portion, to be clear for my listeners, well, they won't do their work. They'll just pray and they go to church and when in, Bible study and all that, they'll do all those activities. But when it comes to the actual part where you're actually sitting around with somebody, you're doing the let's just call it the scientific procedural, or whether it be like that cognitive behavioral therapy, whatever form of therapy you're doing, they won't even touch that. And I feel like they're missing out. You know, a lot of them. It's like that old adage where it's talking about a man who's, his house is flooding. He's on the
Yeah,
top of his roof and he's praying for God, and he sends the boat and then the helicopter, and he's like, God, I call for you, and God's
yeah,
like, I sent you three things, and
yeah,
you know, and so I'm really glad you pointed that out, because I feel sometimes um a lot of people who are faith based, they miss that component, knowing that there are these other resources that you can tap into, that are good for you.
yeah,
And it's a holistic approach. Yes, have your faith, tap into therapy, have the physical component where you go to the gym or you do aerobic exercising or whatever that physical activity is.
yeah. You need both.
So glad you brought that up, brother. So my last major question here, Juwan. Um, Throughout your amazing career in life as a U.S. service member, lobbyist, public affairs professional, father, and husband, um, what would you say is the best lesson you believe you've learned thus far in your 26, 27 years on this planet?
I think the biggest lesson um, is that those titles don't matter.
Mm.
Um, your identity shouldn't be tied to the titles that you have, because those are short lived. I think that if there's one thing that I want folks to learn, especially when I'm gone, of that legacy, is to be authentically who you are and stand on that. Because I think nowadays you have so many folks on social media that aren't really happy. And God has given me the discernment, and I thank Him for it, to be able to see through, in some cases, the money, the makeup, the fresh fit that some of the guys or ties that they wear, um, because that's not real life. I think that you're different by being who you are. God has literally created you to His liking and His design. So it's okay, like for example, it's okay for you to wear somebody else's brand, right?
Mhm.
But don't forget the brand that God has also given you. And I
Mm.
see too many folks in general, whether it's the podcasting space or any major industry, that see something that one person is doing and believes that, they're called to specifically do that, and then they verbatim repeat what somebody else is doing, when all you needed to be original was who you are, because you're enough, with or without
Mm.
titles. And so that's the legacy that I want to leave behind. And I'm at a point in my life, yes, 26. I have a lot more living to do by the grace of God, but the legacy that I want to leave for my kids in this world is that I'm on a mission to change the culture. And so I understand that a lot of what I'm saying might not hit folks until later on in life or when I'm gone, but I just want people to be who they are, because you don't ever have to ask anybody if you sound like somebody else, if you're walking authentically in God's purpose for your life. Period.
Love that. Man, so many gems here. So before we wrap up completely here, Juwan, I do this thing at the end of my conversations. It's rapid fire questions. This is where the actual three questions comes in, just so everyone knows. Where I ask you three rapid fire questions. You give me the first thought that comes to your mind in 5 seconds or less. So this is
Dope.
fun, light, funny. So my first one is, what's your favorite book? Like a book that changed your life?
The new Jim Crow.
The New Jim Crow. I gotta put that on the list. Um, what is a fear that you used to have that is no longer a fear anymore?
Heights.
I like that. What is a quote or a mantra or a scripture that you currently live by? Either one works.
You can't judge a book by its cover.
I love it. I love it. So, Jawan, for my listeners, for my audience that would love to connect with you, follow your journey, find out more about your story, what is the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, man. Thanks, man. So on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn, it's just my name, Juwan, Juwan, Blocker, Blocker. And I, love to connect with everybody.
Amazing. A couple of gems that I took from this conversation is I'm probably paraphrasing a bit here, but
Yeah.
the best version of you is the disciplined you, and that version has boundaries. I love that. And then one of the last things you just said is you are enough with or without titles. And so I'll leave it at that. So, guys, this concludes this episode of 3 Questions. And as many of you know, I like to end each episode by saying this. Sometimes you don't need to hear or see anything new. All you need to do is hear or see that somebody else went through it too. And you heard that with Juwan Blocker. What a last name, by the way. I could say I never heard a last name with Blocker before. Did you play basketball?
Football.
Okay, there you go. Good. What a last name, Blocker. That's original. That is unique and original. I gotta say that. So guys, Juwan and myself are out. Peace and love. Until the next time.